Hi everybody, I hope you're having a good Sunday. So the last video that I did where I argued passionately against mandatory vaccinations and COVID passports and vaccine passports and all of that, I got a lot of good comments, both pro and con. Although one guy did say enough with these stupid videos, and it's kind of interesting because if you look at my videos and the overriding impression that you come away with is one of stupidity, I think that might say more about you than about me. But be that as it may, I'm not going to leave this topic alone. And while I do have a lot of other stuff coming out soon, I've got two major Marilyn Manson related videos. I've got some stuff coming out with Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. And I've got a couple of funny things coming out for you too, in addition to these philosophy videos I had in the pipeline forever. I just need to edit them. Anyway, I have to read this article, or I have to tell, I'm not going to read the whole article, but I have to tell you about this just fascinating article. It is so fabulous because basically these authors, they basically distilled the essence of the best arguments against COVID restrictions. And so the title of the article is The Left's COVID Failure. And I want you to understand that this is written by two self-described leftists, okay? One of them is a professor of history, Toby Green at King's College London. The other is a leftist journalist, Thomas Fazzi, F-A-Z-I. And they are coming at this from the perspective not of right-wingers, but the perspective of leftists who basically think that the left has ceded the moral high ground on this issue, and that the left is basically blind to all of the problems inherent in COVID restrictions and mandatory lockdowns and mandatory vaccines. And so I'm not going to read this whole article to you, and I rarely read articles on my show, but I just thought this was really incredible. And actually it's going to address a number of the points that some of you make in your comments, all right? Now, the first thing that they start off talking about is how it's very strange how opinion on the COVID response had so quickly congealed along ideological lines. In other words, very early on, it became the right. That was the right who were questioning lockdowns and the societal and economic and psychological ramifications of lockdowns, the damage that they could do, and it was the right the people on the right who tended to question mandates, mask mandates, vaccine mandates, etc., while the left quickly congealed around this idea of the collective good and pro-life, public health, public responsibility, that sort of thing. And so one of the points that these authors are raising is that it is alarming to see the way that these very, very complex issues, extremely complex issues surrounding public health policy and law and mandates quickly congealed along these strictly ideological lines. And what they're saying is that anytime that happens, you should be suspicious. You should be suspicious, okay? Because it often means that people are basing their opinions on ideological zealotry more than an actual thoughtful and unbiased or objective review of the situation, right? And that could go for people on both sides, but I'm just saying it's interesting they bring that up. And then they talk about how it's really kind of surprising, given the history of the left and what leftist activists have tended to fight for. It's really surprising that the left has come down on the side of these mandates. And so they talk about, for instance, they talk about the fact that traditionally speaking, in their perspective, it was the left who tended to challenge the state and challenge the authority of the state. And it was, you think about the American Civil Liberties Union, what it used to represent before it was representing, Amber Heard and Elon Musk's interest. I mean, seriously, it was the right, to free speech, the right for the government not to curtail your speech and so forth. And so or think about like the 1960s, counterculture, 1960s and 70s counterculture, that sort of thing, right? All kinds of examples. But they're saying, what has happened here? How have we gotten to the point where there are so few on the left that are publicly speaking out against this vast authority that has been taken by the state, the authority to force people to stay in their homes, the authority to require that people inject a chemical into their bodies, the authority to curtail, to shut down businesses, the authority to curtail all kinds of normal human activities. Why is the left just accepting this? They're saying there's a problem with that. And one of the things that and another thing that the point that they bring up is that the pharmaceutical companies altogether, according to what the study that they're citing, the research that they're citing, the pharmaceutical companies make an average of $1,000 per second on the COVID vaccines. That's in here, and they give a citation for this: $1,000 per second for the COVID vaccines. And the point that these authors make is that traditionally it was the left that was critical of big business and of corporations. And it was the left who would say, hey, hold on, we need to be very skeptical of what corporations say, particularly, Big Pharma, for instance, because they have a vested financial interest in certain pharmaceuticals being pushed to the public. And so there was always this skepticism about big business, and you have to regulate big business, and you have to keep a tight rein on big business and all of that. And they're saying now it's amazing that so few on the left are skeptical of the claims that the pharmaceutical companies are making about their COVID vaccines, and are skeptical of them pushing these vaccines so hard, and of the government, pushing these vaccines so hard, when there's such a huge financial interest. Where, they say, has the left's skepticism of corporations and of corporate greed and corporate malfeasance? Where's that gone? And no, they're not pointing to some vast conspiracy. They're not saying that, Bill Gates got together with, the Illuminati or whatever, and they created this plan that they were going to force people to get vaccinated. They're just saying, look, it's just a basic phenomenon that has traditionally been recognized by many, including many on the left. When corporations have huge financial interest, then we need to be skeptical. Okay? We need to be skeptical of what they're saying. But they're not. People are not being skeptical. And then it goes, the article goes back and it talks about how the left has shifted from some of these more, what we would think of as more traditionally leftist perspectives that I described earlier. They've shifted into a real emphasis on the technocratic state. And that there has a kind of a revolution has occurred in the way that the left views government and the role of government. Now, I know some of you might say, well, that's never really changed. Look at the very extreme left. If we're talking about communist, Soviet Union or whatever. Yeah, I understand that. But they're talking about, their critique here is of what we've seen in the West traditionally, in Europe, and traditionally in America, and how that perspective seems to be changing. And there seems to be a kind of embracing by the left of an embracing of the state, and an embracing of state power and of wide-ranging state authority, and also an embracing of corporatism. And they talk about the 2008 financial crisis, when the government gave, basically through various economic measures, the government basically gave handouts to these huge banks, and basically saying that was that those are policies, Keynesianism, neo-Keynesianism, those are policies that have been endorsed by the left often, and pushed by the left. And so their point being, okay, not to get into the weeds of all that, but their point being is that it is very strange, not only this attitude that the left has, but also this reluctance or complete inadequacy when it comes to being skeptical of these COVID mandates. Now, I want to look in particular at a few sections here that I think are really interesting. It says, citizens now are having their lives and livelihoods upended by the new normal. That the left seems completely oblivious to this is particularly puzzling. After all, the idea that governments tend to exploit crises to further entrench the neoliberal agenda has been a staple of much recent left-wing literature. And he talks about various writers and various, leftist figures, including Naomi Klein, her famous book, The Shock Doctrine, which explored the idea of disaster capitalism. Her central thesis is that in moments of public fear and disorientation, it is easier to re-engineer societies. Dramatic changes to the existing economic order, which would normally be politically impossible, are imposed in rapid-fire succession before the public has had time to understand what is happening. There's a similar dynamic at play today. Take, for example, the high-tech surveillance measures, digital IDs, crackdown on public demonstrations, and fast-tracking of laws introduced by governments to combat the coronavirus outbreak. If recent history is anything to go by, governments will surely find a way to make many of the emergency rules permanent, just as they did with much post-9/11 anti-terrorist legislation. As Edward Snowden has noted, quote, they're quoting Snowden here, "When we see emergency measures passed, particularly today, they tend to be sticky. The emergency tends to be expanded. This confirms, too, the ideas on the state of exception posited by the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, who has nonetheless been vilified by the mainstream left for his anti-lockdown position." Now, what they're saying here is they're saying that that the state always has supposedly good reasons for what it's doing. And maybe initially it is well-meaning, right? But that once you give the state, and he says the left traditionally has understood this, once you give the state a foothold there, then they're not going to give up those powers. They're not going to rescind those measures, right? They will be used again at a further date, and a precedent will have been set. Okay, and again, he's saying that traditionally the left has understood this. We're not talking about, you look at like communist Russia or communist Soviet Union or whatever, obviously very authoritarian. But again, he's talking about they're talking about traditional, Western liberal perspective. Another left-wing fantasy. Oh, it says, ultimately, any form of government action should be judged for what it actually stands for. We support government intervention if it serves to further the rights of workers and minorities, to create full employment, to provide crucial public services, to rein in corporate power, to correct the dysfunctionalities of markets, to take control of crucial industries in the public interest. This is what they're saying. They're saying, as leftists, we support these things. But in the past 18 months, we have witnessed the exact opposite. An unparalleled strengthening of transnational corporate behemoths and their oligarchs at the expense of workers and local businesses. A report last month based on Forbes data showed that America's billionaires alone have seen their wealth increase by $2 trillion during the pandemic. Another left-wing fantasy that has been shuttered by reality is the notion that the pandemic would usher in a new sense of collective spirit, capable of overcoming decades of individualism. On the contrary, the pandemic has fractured societies even more between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, between those who can reap the benefits of smart working from home and those who can't. Moreover, a demos made of traumatized individuals torn apart from their loved ones, made to fear one another as a potential vector of disease, terrified of physical contact. That is hardly a good breeding ground for collective solidarity. Now, let me say that to you again. What they're saying is, if you want to have a healthy society, a healthy collective, what you don't want to have? You don't want to have, let me repeat it for you. You don't want to have fractures between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, between those who can reap the benefits of smart working and those who can't. You don't want to have a society made up of traumatized individuals, torn apart from their loved ones, made to fear one another as a potential vector of disease, terrified of physical contact. And yet, that seems to be, they're saying, the prevailing attitude that is being foisted on us primarily, yes, from the left. And why do I keep talking about the left? I keep talking about the left because a number of people in my audience identify as left-leaning and yet seem to feel exactly as these authors are describing, just a basic sort of unquestioning acceptance and cheering of all these COVID measures, and then also a kind of very, very strong authoritarian judgmentalism about people who don't fall in line or don't want to fall in line. All right, where am I? So, Says perhaps the left's response can be better understood in individual rather than collective terms. And then they're talking about, then they start talking about the psychoanalysis of this. I'm not gonna get into that. But they're saying that there's almost a kind of unconscious authoritarian pleasure that people are exercising in being judgmental and in supporting these COVID restrictions. And he's saying that, you know, that consciously people may feel that they only care about the public good, that they only care about health. And maybe they do primarily, but that in authoritarian perspectives, there is also often, psychoanalytically speaking, an unconscious streak of, you know, I get to tell you what to do. You're wrong. The other day, I saw Russell Brand, who is also, bless his heart, he's against all of these mandatory COVID restrictions and stuff. But he was talking about someone that he read about, or maybe this was a letter he'd gotten from a viewer. And it was a guy who was so obsessed with the idea of making sure that his mother followed all these COVID restrictions during lockdown that he actually stalked her. He stalked his own mother to make sure that she was not straying from the COVID restrictions. I mean, that's the kind of attitude they're talking about here, psychoanalytically speaking. And we would all do well, and I include myself in this, we would all do well to analyze our opinions and ask ourselves, are our opinions truly strictly in the realm of objectivity? And if not, then what else is going on under there? Where is that anger coming from? Why that seething anger that I see among a number of people when they talk about vaccine passports and COVID restrictions and stuff, you know, that real antipathy toward the idea of individual rights or people not being allowed to not want to inject something into their body. All right, another factor. The left's embrace of COVID measures. Another factor explaining the left's embrace of COVID measures is its blind faith in science. Now, here's what I really love, because some of you really are wedded to the notion that the science is all locked up on this. And baby, it ain't locked up. It's not even like anywhere near that. In fact, it's kind of a mess. And there's a lot of contradictory indications, okay, about a lot of this stuff. The left's embrace of COVID measures, its blind faith in, quote, science. This has its roots in the left's traditional faith in rationalism. Nothing wrong with that. However, one thing is believing in the undeniable virtues of the scientific method, but it is another to be completely oblivious to the way those in power exploit science to further their agenda. Being able to appeal to hard scientific data to justify one's policy choices is an incredibly powerful tool in the hands of governments. It is, in fact, the essence of technocracy. Is it technocracy? Yeah, I said that right. Technocracy, anyway. However, this means carefully selecting the science that is supportive of your agenda. See, there's the rub, as Shakespeare would say. Okay, whose science are we talking about, right? It's not always clear cut, and especially with this COVID stuff, okay? Because it's new, and there's a lot of vested interest, and there's a lot of fear, and there's a lot of, big incentives for pharmaceutical companies and governments and all kinds of things, right? Being able to appeal to hard scientific data to justify one's policy choices is an incredibly powerful tool. However, this means carefully selecting the science that is supportive of your agenda and aggressively marginalizing any alternative views, regardless of their scientific value. That's what they're saying is being done. That people are aggressively marginalizing alternative views, legitimate alternative scientific research and views. This has been happening for years in the realm of economics. Is it really hard to believe that such a corporate capture is happening today with regard to medical science? Not according to John P. Ionitis, I think I'm saying that right, sorry. Professor of medicine and epidemiology at Stanford University. Ionitis made headlines in early 2021 when he published, with some colleagues of his, a paper claiming that there was no practical difference in epidemiological terms between countries that had locked down and those that hadn't. The backlash against the paper and against Ionitis in particular was fierce, especially among his fellow scientists. You can't even publish contradictory data without getting shit from people. This explains his recent scathing denunciation of his own profession. So this guy has basically turned on his own profession now because he thinks that science is so messed up right now. In an article entitled, How the Pandemic is Changing the Norms of Science. Oh, I love it. I need to get that one. That might be the next one that I read when I come back to this topic. How the Pandemic is Changing the Norms of Science. Ionitis notes that most people, especially on the left, seem to think that science operates based on the Mertonian norms of communalism, universalism, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism. But alas, that is not how the scientific community actually operates, Ionitis explains. That's what I've been trying to tell some of you. Like, you know, I have a lot of experience in academia, not in the sciences, but in academia. And there's a lot of, even when it comes to science, there's a lot of fads and fashion and peer pressure, okay? It's not cut and dry. It's not. Yeah, there's some basic principles like gravity that I guess are cut and dry, but not this COVID stuff. Not a lot of stuff. With the pandemic, conflicts of corporate interest exploded, and yet talking about them became anathema. He continues. This is that Ionitis guy. He says, consultants who made millions of dollars from corporate and government consultation were given prestigious positions, power, and public praise, while unconflicted scientists who worked pro bono but dared to question dominant narratives were smeared as being conflicted. Organized skepticism was seen as a threat to public health. Yeah, like what's with a number of these countries that are instituting restrictions on basic protests, basic anti-COVID protests? I see a lot of this like in Australia or New Zealand. What's going on down there? Organized skepticism was seen as dangerous, as a threat to public health. That's what he's saying is happening with this COVID stuff. This Ionitis guy, this scientist, he says that in the sciences and in the larger community, that dissent is being actively excoriated and repressed as a public threat. You know, I get that even comments on my videos, people telling me that simply by putting this opinion out there that I'm endangering people. That is really shaky ground when you're saying stuff like that. There was a clash between two schools of thought, authoritarian public health versus science, and quote, he says, quote, science lost. That's what the scientist said. He says there is a clash between authoritarian public health and science is lost. Ultimately, the left's blatant disregard and mockery of people's legitimate concerns over lockdowns, vaccines, or COVID passports is shameful. I'm going to say it one more time. Ultimately, the left's blatant disregard and mockery of people's legitimate concerns is shameful. Not only are these concerns rooted in actual hardship, in other words, a lot of people have real reasons like for why they're against lockdowns or mandatory masking or mandatory vaccinations. It's not just some like frivolous political stand, okay? Not only are these concerns rooted in actual hardship, but they also stem from an understandable distrust of governments and institutions that have been undeniably captured by corporate interest. Anyone who favors a truly progressive interventionist state, as we do, needs to address these concerns, not dismiss them. But where the left's response has been found most wanting is on the world stage in terms of the relationship of COVID restrictions to deepening poverty. And then they talk about worldwide the way that lockdowns and various COVID restrictions have deepened poverty. I'm not going to read it, but you know it. A lot of you know it anyway. He says, the writers say, mainly, this has been a historic failure from the left, which will have disastrous consequences. Any form of popular dissent is likely to be hegemonized once again by the extreme right, poleaxing any chance the left has of winning round the voters it needs to overturn right-wing hegemony. In other words, look, they're writing from the perspective of left-leaning people. I've told you I'm more right of center. But they're writing from the perspective of the left, and they're saying, look, we are ceding a kind of ideological moral high ground to the right here because it's the people on the right who are the only ones talking about civil liberties and questioning this stuff. And that's a shame. And they said it's going to have consequences in elections, right? Once again, we're ceding all of these voters and all of this and this legitimate perspective to the right. Meanwhile, the left holds on to a technocracy of experts severely undermined by what is proving to be a catastrophic handling of the pandemic in terms of social progressivism. As any kind of viable, electable left fades into the past, the discussion and dissent at the heart of any true democratic process is likely to fade with it. So anyway, I just wanted to read that to you. There's a lot that I didn't read in there. I encourage you to check out the article yourself. It's called The Left's COVID Failure. And I'm going to be talking about this more. I'm not gonna shut up about it, but I'm going to be talking about a lot of other things too. So I'll be revisiting this topic. Please leave your comments. I'll be revisiting this topic probably in another couple of weeks or so. And I just want to say once again, I really appreciate the people who donate, because the videos I make, particularly these videos that I actually lose subscribers and lose support when I put this stuff out there, it does take a lot of guts, honestly. And I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back. I'm just saying, like, it took a long time for me to work up the nerve to be honest about how I feel about this COVID stuff. And so I do appreciate any support that you give, and I do appreciate all of you. So I hope that you have a good weekend, and I'll probably be putting out a Marilyn Manson video tonight or tomorrow, and then I've got some great interviews coming up you're going to really love, and some philosophy videos in the works. And for my Manson viewers, I'm going to be talking more about this Christianity issue. Talking about what I think is going on with Manson, how I feel about it with the whole Christianity, Kanye thing. And then also I'm going to be doing a series of videos about Christianity, because actually in my classes, I do a Christianity unit sometimes where I talk about the philosophy of Christianity and some of the deeper meaning of Christianity and everything. So I think that'd be kind of cool. All right, I'll see y'all later. Bye.